is attached to the bottom half of the or bottom part of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is one of the key regulatory glands in regards to blood pressure, heart rate, and the vasal response to exercise. The the anterior pituitary gland secretes many different hormones in response to the hypothalamus. So when the hypothalamus releases its hormone or its signals, then that also acts as a closed loop feedback system. So that's going to trigger the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones. The anterior pituitary gland releases growth hormone, which is an anabolic hormone. There's anabolic and catabolic hormones. Anabolic things build up, and catabolic break down. So the release of growth hormone allows for tissue buildup and muscle growth and all sorts of tissue building mechanisms. It's going to promote hypertrophy when you're doing hypertrophy training, and it's also going to stimulate fat metabolism to make sure that your body has plenty of fuel for energy. If I exercise more, then there's more growth hormone release. So rather than taking necessarily supplements for growth hormone, especially for me that doesn't exercise too much, if I wanted to naturally increase the amount of growth hormone in my body, then I would just want to exercise more and exercise at a higher intensity. The thyroid gland secretes triiodothyronine and thyroxine. Those are two hormones that lead to the increase in the utilization of fuel, protein synthesis, which is the buildup of muscle, the size of mitochondria and the number, which is going to mean that there's going to be more opportunity to use oxygen for fuel, a greater glucose uptake by the cells so that there's more fuel for contraction, greater rate of glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose in the muscle and in the liver, and glycolysis, lysis, glyco is glycogen, and lysis is the breaking. So the breaking down of glycogen to become sugar again. And gluconeogenesis is the formation. Genesis is beginning, neo is new, the new beginning of glucose from remnants of amino acids and fat and free fatty acids that are broken down during metabolism can be formed again to eventually make glucose. So triiodothyronine and thyroxine are released by the thyroid gland, and they regulate the speed at which glucose is created by things around it. Usually that's going to need to happen when the blood glucose levels are low, or when the athlete is in like a long bout of activity and they're burning through all their carbohydrate. The body wants to make sure that it has enough fuel for energy, so it's going to start to utilize fatty acids, free fatty acids, mobilize free fatty acids out of the visceral fat and out of the cells, so that it can get through beta oxidation. It's going to start to take the liver glucose and create a little bit the glycogen that's stored in the liver and create more glucose so that the stores of glucose are utilized for energy, also that you don't have to use protein for fuel. It says protein synthesis is going to start to occur on slide 23, and that's to make sure that the protein, the fat-free masses are not utilized for energy. The thyroid gland is also going to release thyrotropin. It's also called thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Travels to the thyroid, and it acts as a feedback mechanism to release triiodothyronine and thyroxine. Natural exercise increases the TSH response, which is going to increase the amount of thyroxine, and also prolonged exercise is going to result in a downregulation of triiodothyronine and also thyroxine. So that's a case where one hormone is going to act as a negative feedback mechanism for another hormone. It's like a system, a closed loop feedback system. That's where the regulation of hormones occurs. That's how hormones know when to be released and when to be suppressed based on potentially the amount of other hormones that are rushing through the body. The adrenal medulla releases catecholamines. You have the adrenal gland is right above the kidneys, and there's different layers of the adrenal gland. There's the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer, and the adrenal medulla, which is an inner layer. The adrenal medulla, which is the inner layer, releases catecholamines, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are like when you get afraid and you feel that sudden rush of heart rate, or when you're about to get in a fight with somebody and you feel that huge pump of energy. It's because epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine are pumping through your system. Epinephrine makes it so that anything that has to do with getting out of getting out of the situation that you're in, needs to be enhanced. Like if you need to run quick, you're going to need a higher heart rate so that you can get more oxygen to the muscles. You're going to need vasodilation of blood vessels into the muscles so that more blood flow can get there. You're going to need a higher blood pressure to pump more out to pump more heart blood out of the heart. So epinephrine is going to make it so that your body has more energy so that it can get out of wherever it needs to be. With increased exercise, there is an increase in the sympathetic nervous system, and the increase in sympathetic nervous system is like the sympathetic nervous system is also in charge of an increase in heart rate, blood pressure. So that's going to work very closely with epinephrine and norepinephrine. The catecholamine release, like we said, increases heart rate, contractile force, blood pressure, glycogenolysis, free fatty acid utilization, blood flow to skeletal muscles, so that glucose levels are maintained, so that your brain still has the ability to function, so that you don't start using protein as your fuel source, and so that you can make sure that you have enough fuel and enough oxygen to get out of a particularly troubling situation. The adrenal cortex releases what's called corticosteroids, glucocorticoids, and also mineralocorticoids and gonadocorticoids. Those are going to increase the gluconeogenesis, through like almost taking the remnants of protein and free fatty acid breakdown and combine all of them. Remember, carbohydrate, protein, and fat are all made of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So the breakdowns of those fuels is going to leave plenty of empty carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens throughout the body and the bloodstream. And those are going to be combined to make new glucose. So cortisol, which is a major glucocorticoid, is going to be released, and it's going to actually work in opposite of insulin. Insulin is going to try to utilize the blood glucose for fuel and energy, and the cortisol is going to increase gluconeogenesis. It's going to increase the utilization and the moving of free fatty acids out of the cell into the mitochondria so that it can be utilized for fuel. It's going to increase protein catabolism. Catabolism is breakdown of tissue. So it's going to increase protein catabolism, so protein can be used as a fuel. Cortisol is going to be released when there are very, very little levels or very, very low levels of blood glucose, or when your muscle activity, like you're running on a treadmill for a long period of time and the blood glucose levels are decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. You're going to need to get glucose from somewhere else so you can maintain central nervous system functioning and so that you don't use your own protein stores for fuel. So cortisol is going to increase the creation of new glucose. It's going to increase fatty acid mobilization, but it's also going to allow for the breakdown of free fat of muscle tissues so that you can at least have enough energy. So that's going to be cortisol is going to be released in situations where blood glucose levels are relatively low. The pancreas, we're on slide 27. The pancreas is going to release insulin. Insulin is predominantly involved with the utilization and the transportation of blood glucose through the bloodstream. When there's too much blood sugar, too much sugars in the blood, hyperglycemia, then what's going to happen is insulin is going to try to take the blood sugar, bring it to the muscle so that the muscle can utilize it for exercise and the brain can utilize it for energy, or it's going to take extra blood sugar and bring it to the liver so that the liver can change it to glycerol, and then glycogen, and then that glycogen can be stored and can go through glycogenolysis to be utilized for carbohydrate and blood glucose at a later date. Um, um, Insulin is going to allow for an increase in utilization of glucose by the muscles so that the muscles have fuel for exercise. And it's going to also be influential in the increase in storage of that sugar for later on. The release of insulin, like we said, counters cortisol in that cortisol tries to make gluconeogenesis, or tries to take stored sugars and use stored sugars and also remnants of the macronutrients that could potentially become sugars. It inhibits Insulin inhibits those activities, so the blood glucose and whatever glucose is in the bloodstream can be utilized, or whatever blood sugars are in the muscle tissues itself can be utilized. Okay, so the pancreas also releases glucagon, which raises blood glucose levels. It counters hypoglycemia and opposes insulin. So you have like a feedback mechanism there within the pancreas itself, where glucagon and insulin are kind of acting as negative feedback information for each other. During exercise, glucose has got to be available to tissues, and it's either going to be utilized by the glucose that's in the bloodstream and in the muscle itself, or glycogenolysis, which is the transformation of stored glucose, which is in the form of glycogen, muscle and liver glycogen, back to glucose, or gluconeogenesis is where free fatty acids and proteins can combine to make new glucose. Remember, free fatty acids, as I mentioned before, and protein are all made of carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens to some level. So there's no reason that those carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens can't reform with different chemical bonds in the form of glucose, and that's exactly what gluconeogenesis is doing. During exercise, glucose could potentially be released by the liver if there's not enough blood glucose, or not enough sugar in the bloodstream. Glucose is going to be absorbed by the muscles so that the muscles have more fuel for further bouts of exercise. And the hormones that increase the amount of glucose in the bloodstream are glucagon, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Slide 30. How does carbohydrate metabolism get regulated during exercise? Well, it depends. So number one, it depends on the exercise intensity and the duration. If you're exercising at a high intensity and your blood glucose levels are falling and falling and falling, then what's going to happen is the liver is going to start to release more blood glucose so that a homeostasis can be met. We're on slide 31. As exercise intensity increases and you start to utilize and need to utilize more carbohydrate for fuel, the catecholamine release is going to increase, which is going to increase the rate of glycogenolysis, which is going to increase the amount of blood sugar or glucose that's going to the liver and the muscles. And then the muscle glycogen, the glycogen in the muscle is going to be used up, and then any liver glycogen that's released into the bloodstream that gets to the muscles will be used. As exercise duration increases, more and more liver activity occurs so that more and more glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Glycogenolysis occurs, and more blood glucose or more glucose can be created by the liver to make sure that it's combating the fact that during long duration exercises, slowly but surely, the blood glucose levels are dropping. If the blood glucose levels are dropping and there's not enough sugar in the muscle cells, then not only can the muscles not contract, but also the central nervous system is going to start to get fatigued, and then there's going to be a serious reduction in overall performance. Figure 4.4 shows the relationship of each of those particular hormones with the actually, sorry, not hormones, glucose isn't a hormone, but each of those particular steroids or I don't know what sugars or whatever in the body as the time of or the duration of the exercise increases. So you'll see that the amount of glucose relatively stays somewhat the same, because what happens is as the body is using all of the extra glucose, epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucagon, and cortisol all start to increase and regulate, so that extra glucose is either created or released from the liver and the muscle cells, so that the amount of glucose always stays the same. So you'll notice that epinephrine and norepinephrine pretty much climb regularly so that they can continue to trigger a release or a creation of glucose from gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis from the liver and the muscles. Not only does insulin help with the mobilization of glucose through the body, but it also helps glucose get uptaken into the muscle. During exercise, insulin concentrations reduce. This is going to be the next slide, figure 4.5. And that might seem a little counterintuitive. If more sugar needs to be distributed to the muscle cells during exercise, why would insulin concentrations reduce? And it could be the case that the insulin sensitivity increases. So if the insulin sensitivity or the number of receptors on the muscle cells increases, then the work that the pancreas needs to do during high bouts of activity, while the body is susceptible to huge reductions in glucose, is reduced. So it's probably serves as some type of safety mechanism to make it so that the pancreas doesn't have to do as much work. If there's more glucose uptake into the cells, then you have to use less insulin, and over time, the pancreas is more efficient. Desensitization of insulin can be less severe, or if it happens at all, and so that's the story. Figure 4.5 on slide 34 shows you the same thing. It says that although glucose initially increases and stays the same, there's an overall reduction in insulin in the blood because of the increase in insulin sensitivity. Figure 35, this is the regulation of fat metabolism during exercise as opposed to carbohydrate metabolism. When muscle glycogen and liver glycogen is depleted, you're going to need some fat energy substrates. The free fatty acids that were attached to the glycerol backbone are now going to be mobilized and utilized through beta oxidation and lipolysis, the breakdown of fat, so that you can have the Krebs cycle make ATP. The triglycerides are going to be broken down into free fatty acids plus a glycerol. That glycerol is going to be eventually broken down and utilized for gluconeogenesis, and the free fatty acids, which are stored as triglycerides in the adipose tissue, are going to be transported to the muscle and broken down to go through oxidation in the mitochondria. Lipolysis, which is the breakdown or the breaking in half, the lysis of lipo, which is fat, is going to be stimulated by a reduction in insulin. It's also going to be triggered by epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. All of these are going to stimulate the breakdown of fat through lipase. Lipase is an enzyme that's going to help initiate the separation of the